Hey everyone, and welcome back to the deepest part of the night. Make sure you're comfortable and fully settled in for a long one. If the sound of rain helps you shut down and drift into sleep, then you've found your sanctuary here, a place where darkness meets calm. And if this blend of deep horror and a calming storm helps you find that inner quiet, please take a moment to hit like and subscribe for more long, rainy nights. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. Now, let the rain wash your worries away, breathe in the silence of the storm. Let's begin the journey. Story 1. I live in a new, small, completely quiet suburb 10 miles outside of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a typical tract home with a detached garage, perfectly private, designed completely for maximum electronic convenience. My entire safety net was linked to my single point of external vigilance, a high-tech wireless, motion-triggered video doorbell system, positioned exactly over my front door. I ran a single, solitary commercial photography contract from the house, utterly isolated in my simple utility room in the dead core of every night. My hours were late, forcing me to rely completely on the system's external safety for my emotional security. The cold, pervasive, intense rain of the Great Lakes winter had entirely settled over the whole suburban neighborhood, creating one massive, chaotic, silver-white sheet of constant, rhythmic, comforting white noise. The rain on the roof was the one sound I trusted. My terror began specifically at 3:07 a.m. on an absolutely profound, cold, miserable, empty night. The intense, deafening sound of the internal chime of the wireless doorbell system suddenly, briefly, rang. Not as a short, simple ding, but as a desperate, terrified, persistent, long drrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrr total silence. I was alone, wide awake, and entirely rigid in the interior security room, listening to the intense sonic aftermath of the sudden break-in. No emergency calls had been triggered, the external alarm remained entirely silent. But the absolute terror of the intrusion was immediate, the simple, rhythmic, constant slam of the cold, horizontal rain on the roof had not been enough to completely blur the final, single acoustic signal. I lunged for the small, handheld security monitor, ripping the active screen on and quickly tracing the audio-visual confirmation. The exterior image was entire cold grayscale, brilliantly clear, fixed precisely on the front 8 feet of my front porch and final walkway. The visual was absolute. The porch was entirely empty. No human presence, no moving shadow, no abandoned package, no trick of wind or light, nothing but the massive, blindingly bright intensity of the single, permanent security floodlight, pouring relentless, steady, cold light onto the white concrete. The system was completely silent, completely safe, completely secure. The motion trigger grid was completely flat, reading only the steady flow of wind-driven rain. But the bell had violently, physically rung. My mind completely fractured. I was now entirely consumed by the absolute, simple, obvious visual unreality I had just encountered. I had been directly invaded by a deliberate, organized, complete acoustic signal that defied physical presence on the entire exterior. I immediately walked slowly to the front door, peered out the small top spy hole, saw only the clear white sheet of the vast, open space in front of me, and confirmed the silence. Absolute, visual, cold space and comfort. The final terror began 15 minutes later. I was sitting entirely down at my computer station, trying to force my brain back into work routine, when the terror reappeared. The small, active security monitor, still showing the immense white cone of safety under the simple security light, suddenly began to physically fade to black. Not with an external loss of power or signal, but smoothly, slowly, methodically, an aggressive wave of complete darkness consumed the digital screen surface, physically pushing the white light and the digital input out over the edges of the tiny visual plane. The powerful motion sensor light, the massive white cone which should have been permanent, was being eaten entirely in the massive, organized digital visual sequence. The profound psychological fear gripped me entirely. And here came the final, complete, organizing horror. The digital darkness completely filled the miniature screen with perfect blackness. Then, the single, clear image formed immediately, placed perfectly horizontally and vertically right across the entire center of the destroyed screen. A massive, human-sized, black, deeply silhouetted figure appeared, not moving, not swaying. Entirely still, directly and wholly casting an immense, clean shadow profile over the entire, obliterated white light array of the digital screen. The shadow was immense, fully man-sized, and dominated the entire field. The overwhelming light was gone, and only this immense, silent, single image remained. But the terrifying sight was accompanied instantly by a clear, powerful, familiar acoustic consequence. The entire internal sound system in my isolated house began to ring again, not with the previous chaotic desperation, but now with a quiet, confident, complete, profound ding, perfectly controlled, polite, and completely non-committal. The terrifying visual image of the black silhouette completely leaned itself slowly, deliberately, into its digital frame, its massive, dark head tilting in an attitude of intense scrutiny and immense curiosity, its singular black eyes entirely focused on the digital speaker element that had just carried the massive acoustic signal of the single door chime. The entire action was silent, patient, and entirely committed to a single, deep, permanent violation. I finally understood the core truth of the glitched doorbell. The simple act of ringing the door chime was the singular source of powering the creature, a deliberate act of using acoustic aggression as its single food source. And now, the completely empowered silhouette was examining the perfect output of its frightening, singular, focused meal with complete satisfaction. I fled the house, leaping the back fence in a panic and running hard, entirely abandoning the entire clean structure and the massive technological defense I had relied on. I never looked back at the simple, terrifying, small black box in the center of the door again, knowing with absolute certainty that the system had done its singular, terrible job. The simple sound of the terrifying intrusion was the single, lethal final price of its defense, and the physical consequence of my fear had opened the final door to a permanent, unremitting technological control over my existence. Story 2. I work an overnight contract for an absolute relic of the industrial high plains, a single, massive, abandoned high-speed oil tanker refueling station situated exactly a half-mile from the intersection of I-90 and US 2 in the remote, desolate heart of eastern Washington state. The structure was dead, but its external system lights were paid for by a perpetual state contract. The entire station forecourt was entirely silent, cold, massive, and completely uninsulated open concrete, constantly battered by the intense, driving, chaotic rain that completely consumes the high plains at night. My single, terrifying job was twofold: security watch within the glass booth and a full audit check on the single external power source. The initial terror was absolute silence. But the real problem was on the dispensing forecourt. The long line of metal pumps, all 12 of them permanently padlocked and sealed for 6 years. Each one of them, with a single sheet of heavy black plastic stretched over its entire face, was a massive, clean silhouette against the single, sickly, consistent yellow glow of the permanent overhead light standard. I was making my 3 a.m. walkthrough, wrapped tightly in my plastic slicker, listening to the intense sonic echo of the horizontal rain, when I found the aberration. 2 pumps away from me, pump number 8, an immense, 8-foot-tall, thick metal pillar, was entirely wet. Not damp from the ambient, horizontal, driving rain, but saturated from top to bottom in a running, immense volume of clear, incredibly cold, completely unidentifiable liquid. The surface ran dark and cold, almost fully dripping onto the concrete base plate. The rest of the 12 pumps, sitting in the identical weather, were only damp. I swiped the single, slow film of cold liquid with my 2 fingers, isolating the temperature source. The liquid was utterly cold, incredibly cold, far beyond the ambient cold of the storm. The terrifying liquid was actively drawing immense, internal heat from the base metal, leaving a clean, thin, dense layer of ice forming rapidly on its thick, cold, metal nozzle head. My instinct screamed the single, correct technological conclusion. The gas tank entity was consuming, not dispensing, but concentrating, storing, and actively transferring external cold energy inside the massive metal housing. I backed away completely and instantly, abandoning all pretense of physical safety. My high-intensity security light swept fast across the 12 massive pumps. The sheer speed of the rain prevented accurate visual confirmation. But as I walked away, retreating toward the safety of my lit and heated glass shack 50 yards away, I heard one single, terrifying, complex sound from the source. The immense, organized, rhythmic tapping noise, which was an anomaly, immediately ceased. The silence was absolute. The cold, wet, absolute sound terror was replaced by the horrific, dry, organized clacking, the precise, complex sound of a single, heavy, metal handprint smashing hard and violently onto the exterior surface of the metallic pump housing, immediately dragging its physical presence and shape down the wet, cold metal side to compress its immense physical length onto the ground in search of a specific target. The physical action was slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly precise in its cold, metallic intensity. I ran the final 50 yards in absolute, high-intensity panic, throwing myself through the emergency latch of the security booth and slamming the heavy steel door locked. I immediately turned all my security monitors directly against the terrorist point of contact, the huge, plate glass section of the main window facing all 12 fuel pumps. My internal safety was absolute. But here came the final terror. Directly on the exterior surface of the massive window, where I knew the physical contact of the immense, cold entity would focus, a slow, single, terrifying formation began. The outside surface of the window, totally exposed to the cold external air, began to rapidly freeze. A dense, organized, expanding sheet of thick, white ice formed immediately, perfectly centered, over the absolute core viewing area of the glass. The massive freeze radiated outward, covering the glass in a tight, unyielding, permanent film of complete cold, which made me feel that immense, overwhelming physical pressure in my full veins. My view of the exterior forecourt, my final anchor to the visual reality of the immense chaos, was annihilated entirely by the powerful, contained, organized cold that now consumed the single section of the massive window. The visual barrier had been physically completed. The terrifying ice formed in a complete, immense 5-foot diameter semicircle, instantly covering half my total visual perimeter. And in the absolute, silent, still center of the thick, white, unyielding layer of the massive freezing event, a single, perfectly inscribed, enormous, utterly precise, detailed, black sludge handprint, a massive, cold, clear, 5-digit outline of fingers, appeared in the deep middle of the ice. The immense print was directly exposed, looking entirely down at my own trapped body. I abandoned everything in the booth, leaving the key and the money behind. I called the supervisor, frantic, asking for a full system emergency audit of all 12 fuel pumps. The report concluded one single, organized, logical anomaly: Pump 8 was completely dry, locked, and fully functional, but its internal reservoir showed a complete negative reading on its inventory. The simple accounting was wrong. The terrifying truth of the gas tank entity was simple: it was not a hostile poltergeist. It was a massive, simple, powerful, intelligent, parasitic entity of pure, focused, cold chemical pressure that had learned only one physical action: how to fully drain all external energy from the available system to permanently sustain its immense, organized, physical internal form. And every single time its cold physical form needed external assistance, it generated a localized, aggressive signal of terror, cold, and manufactured, perfect isolation to find my single available physical energy source. Story 3. I was the senior maintenance chief, overseeing the immense process of safely demolishing a massive, sprawling, century-old hydroelectric power dam on the Columbia River. The structure, all cold, dark, immense, old-growth concrete, was a complete technological relic, permanently dead, sealed off, and scheduled for precise sectional demolition. My base was simply a small, abandoned, glass-sealed, single-man control booth perched precariously 400 feet above the entire valley. My work kept me isolated and consumed by endless paperwork. The background sound was deafening, monotonous, and immense: the heavy, sheer roar of the dam's overflow system mixed with the chaotic, relentless sound of the deep, cold, atmospheric rain, which endlessly lashed the glass enclosure. My terror began entirely in spite of the overwhelming physical chaos and sound. I was signing off on the final structural closure of the main turbine hall, the massive, cold, deep section of the facility below the river line where all the sheer immense industrial power of the structure had once been focused, a full 5 stories down. My handheld structural analyzer, which registered all core frequency outputs, remained oddly silent. But my own perception, even through the dense, high acoustic volume of the endless chaos, picked up a single, rhythmic, incredibly high-pitched internal noise, ping, ping, ping. It was the sound of a heavy, precise metal hammer hitting a single, empty, high-tensile steel structural support beam deep below the ground line. The sound was faint, pure, rhythmic, totally mechanical, and completely drowned out by the external rain. I pressed my ear hard against the cold metal of the tower base. The rhythmic metallic ping only intensified, forcing itself through the sheer tonnage of structural steel, completely unmuffled by the immense surrounding noise. I immediately grabbed my old, industrial issue, 2-foot-long adjustable monkey wrench, my simple, trusted tool, and raced down the hundreds of flights of the cold, wet, rattling metal internal stairs to find the source. Logic stated a single piece of cold, stressed steel must have failed its bond. It took me 10 full, terrifying minutes to find the exact source deep inside the vast, cold, concrete machine pit. The rhythmic ping was entirely localized, coming from the perfect, flat, metal wall of a completely decommissioned reservoir cooling tank, a massive, 30-foot-high, empty steel unit, sealed high above the main flood control floor. The immense tank, completely sealed up, should have been sterile and entirely silent. But sitting precisely on the small access port hatch on the bottom of the external seam, right where the sound emanated, was a large, wet, immensely black, leather-bound, old-style schoolbook bag. The external surface of the immense object was entirely covered in a thick, dense, waterlogged black silt and coal dust, the exact, specific chemical component of the submerged ground sediment the structure rested on. I backed up slowly, training my high-intensity light on the silent bag. The rhythmic ping ceased completely, immediately replaced by a quick, organized, soft series of 3 simple, intelligent knock-knock-knock sounds coming from directly inside the metal tank itself. The simple rhythm was entirely clear, contained, aggressive, and highly intentional. The enormous silence that followed the 3 distinct taps was immediately replaced by a single, high-pitched, exhausted, low, entirely dry whisper emanating directly from the empty external air of the space between the massive structural tank and my freezing body. "Where is his map? He should have found the line for the exit now. Only the map works now. You must find it and follow his plan." The urgent, high-pitched male voice, driven by enormous emotional intensity, only faded when I physically lunged backward. I understood the simple terror immediately. The persistent, rhythmic, precise acoustic attack on the silent tank was not a simple poltergeist. The overwhelming organized signal was a single, sustained, terrifying mental signal from the soul of a single, deeply lost, dead apprentice engineer who was permanently trapped inside the sealed structure after the final flood control closure 10 years prior. His overwhelming psychic trauma had entirely consumed all internal physical resistance, forcing his mind to repeat only the simple mechanical acoustic pattern that would draw the single living subject to his exact final resting place. I fled the machine pit completely and instantly, abandoning all tools and equipment, scrambling and running hard up the terrifyingly long ladder to the safe structure of the control room. I did not stop until I was standing inside the familiar, immense sound of the entire final storm. The complex was entirely silent. The immense sound returned to its normal, relentless roar. I quit the contract immediately. I never went back. The final, terrible, chilling truth of the lost engineer's map was revealed after a simple phone inquiry to the decommissioning project archives. The vast, immense complexity of the power structure was a perfect replica of the immense structural reality that had completely consumed all final exits. The damn engineer had physically failed his final structural audit, trapping himself and a final relic completely inside the sealed tank structure after ignoring the safety check. His final desperate attempt to escape was leaving both the single physical school bag, the single object closest to his last living actions, and a single, immense, subtle acoustic vibration as a message for an external living soul to finally find and use the single element he had relied on most for survival. His agonizing, rhythmic, trapped final message was now forever sealed with the structural integrity of the final contract. But his quiet, perfect, single plea remains a persistent sound distortion in every single low-frequency sound system I ever turn on. Story 4. Up Interstate 10 in the absolute, high-altitude desolation of the Arizona desert, the small, solitary, two-story roadside viewpoint was simply a monument to absolute emptiness, a completely defunct, long-abandoned tourist overlook where the final, cold, dry, white concrete jutted precariously out over a monstrous, deep, immense canyon basin. My work as a freelance structural photographer brought me there. I specialized in industrial remnants, but the true lure was the impending, massive, cold, aggressive, chaotic storm, which had turned the clear blue sky into an unnerving chaos of low, purple, and gold. I was standing alone on the absolute final edge of the crumbling concrete terrace, setting up my long-exposure camera for a single, perfect final panoramic shot. The wind was immense, high, and constant, but the sound of the rain was intense, aggressive, and rhythmic on the massive, single, metal-sheeted observation rail. My fear began passively, a single glance at my final, unedited photo file. I adjusted the high-resolution setting for full, 10-second total capture, anticipating the massive, high-contrast, atmospheric shot. The single photo appeared immediately on the immense, clear screen of the digital camera. The captured frame showed only the massive, empty canyon and the incredible turbulence of the oncoming weather. But positioned in the extreme foreground, right near the edge of the collapsing concrete where I had set my massive tripod, a profound, precise, high-intensity anomaly of human presence was embedded into the final still image. Not one, but 3 separate humans were frozen in time on the captured exposure: a man, a woman, and a young child, all completely still, perfectly framed, standing precisely where I stood a single minute prior, looking not at the beautiful geological abyss, but staring with absolute, immense focus directly up into the turbulent sky at an image of pure, high velocity, white chaos that did not actively exist in the natural setting. I immediately checked the area around my tripod. The sheer, empty, cold concrete was entirely still, devoid of all human life and movement. The figures in the single frame were utterly impossible. Terror gripped me immediately. My sanity screamed the truth. The spot I was standing on in the physical present was a single, immense, precise intersection of 2 entirely separate timelines, and my camera had just physically breached the visual integrity of the past. The photograph had not captured reality. It had forced a perfect, still, high-resolution, fixed reality from a single, chaotic, high-intensity moment of immense fear 50 years earlier. I was standing in their terror. Driven by utter psychological breakdown, I deleted the high-resolution image immediately. The moment the file was entirely deleted, a massive, deafening, high, physical shriek of intense high-frequency white static exploded from the single speaker of my complex, professional camera, a static outburst containing deep, guttural, aggressive, rapid human shouting that sounded entirely full of immense, violent rage. The extreme sound lasted a full, agonizing minute, completely overriding and dominating the immensely high volume of the external cold, non-stop rain. The high-frequency sonic assault was immediately replaced by a quick, calm, decisive, single, highly professional whisper emanating precisely from the internal microphone of my now-dead camera body. "You do not delete the final memory. We are still here. Now look behind the lens to find your end." I abandoned my camera, throwing it 500 feet into the open, devastating chasm of the entire valley floor and sprinting hard for my immobilized work truck. The full force of the chaotic external storm hit my body with a violent, overwhelming pressure, immediately pinning my movement into place. The full terror was cemented in my final image. The immense sheet of glass on the front windshield of the truck was completely obscured by the torrential, thick, intense rain. But in the small, clean, high visual line of the main wiper, a massive, immense, perfectly clean, incredibly detailed black silhouette of a man's torso and head suddenly materialized. The towering, silent, dark figure was entirely still, blocking all forward visual movement. The entire enormous human figure was entirely composed of single, small, highly organized, immensely dense dark fog and rain material, pressed hard against the windshield and staring directly into the intense whiteness of my terrified eyes. The figure did not move. I simply bailed out of the locked truck immediately, screaming, entirely abandoning the highly valuable cargo and the entire isolated area, running completely blind and hard into the massive, dark, profound, utter chaos of the vast, open desert environment. My final, logical terror, the roadside viewpoint's curse was definitive, and I had simply provided the single remaining, missing physical element to the ancient terror. The dead family of 50 years ago did not want me to share their photo, they only wanted to deliver the perfect, terrifyingly composed, physical visual message to the living observer, that not only had their past tragic failure been completely, entirely preserved in physical time, but a final, powerful, enormous, physical figure had just been completely constructed by the organized elements I did not believe in and was entirely ready to follow me home. Story 5. My new apartment complex near Seattle was an entirely modern fortress of anonymity, all secure digital keypads and seamless, clean interior walls. My paranoia, however, was anchored to a single, unsettling feature that defied the structure's modern uniformity. One very large interior wall in my utility room adjacent to the shower was mysteriously and permanently covered in a thick, dense, black film of industrial-grade latex paint. It was entirely unlike any other smooth, pristine wall in the entire complex, seemingly sealed off against any possible external disturbance. My single source of comfort was the rhythmic, soporific wash of the sustained, cold, external rain that battered the building's exterior. The subtle psychological terror began when I was alone, sitting quietly in my apartment, entirely enveloped by the deep, internal quiet. I looked at the black wall, and I suddenly noticed that the entire large, smooth black surface had become intensely and completely wet. Not damp to the touch, but completely, rapidly saturated by a massive film of slick, cold runoff water that was slowly, unnervingly and silently running down the intense surface onto the white concrete floor. The water itself was clean, clear, and perfectly cold. As I rushed my hand toward the immense saturation, the entire black surface immediately washed its entire volume dry in a terrifying, sudden, synchronized speed that defied all physical evaporative reality, leaving the massive paint sheet entirely matte black and permanently dry. No human logic could explain the spontaneous burst of immense, focused liquid and its subsequent, complete non-existence. My psychological battle against the wall's simple presence intensified, driven by an acute need to completely understand the physical source of the unresolvable cold. I was standing in front of the wall, shining my high-intensity light on the blackness. The entire matte surface remained profoundly dry. Then, as I moved further back into the central room, isolating the entire black expanse entirely in the single visual line of my focus, a terrifying distortion occurred on the surface. Within the massive sheet of undisturbed black paint, a single, clear, white vertical line of complete, brilliant, intense reflection began to form slowly. The reflection was impossibly clear, entirely unweathered, and precisely my own image, positioned slightly to the right, fully out of the expected center frame. The reflection was entirely composed of an incredible, focused energy of pure negative light, a terrifying, single, intensely reflective visual intrusion into the absolute black space that should have entirely consumed all photons around it. My gaze paralyzed me. The reflection of my rigid body was not mirroring my absolute stillness. The man in the paint, my perfectly reflected self, was intensely focused on a single spot, the single largest, most visible, palpable line of raw, immense emotional tension that permeated the physical lines of my exhausted face. The reflection then immediately broke from its stillness, It began to move its wide, unblinking eyes precisely 3 complete seconds ahead of my frantic muscle movement, perfectly predicting where my full attention should have been before my logic could move. The entire frightening image was a physical, psychological challenge to my mind's internal integrity, entirely driven by the profound external pressure of the isolated, cold silence. I screamed and threw the only available soft material at the terrifying image, a clean, white cotton bed sheet. The sheet made a soft whish sound in the air and settled gently, wholly, entirely onto the dry, matte black painted wall, completely, physically obscuring the intense, terrifying, psychological visual attack. The terrifying sonic consequence was immediate. From deep behind the painted surface, a single, incredibly clear, terrifying thump began, a profound, resonant, simple sound of something massive, singular, and final hitting the interior plaster with an organized, solid force. The sound was immediately followed by a raw, guttural, low, terrified, prolonged man's crying, a long, controlled sound of immense, sustained emotional collapse and final submission. The immense weeping was entirely devoid of any residual material sound. The full terror was cemented in my ears. An active, organized, controlling psychic force now entirely enveloped the entire structural material of the deep, black wall, and it had finally delivered its absolute, final warning. I fled the apartment immediately. I abandoned all my personal inventory and my high-paying contract, leaving the terrifying source of absolute, psychological trauma completely intact. The reflection under the rain was not a simple structural crack that leaked water. The single, immense, black-painted wall on that floor was a vast, ancient, psychological internment field, capable of absorbing the complex stress memories and powerful self-loathing of every single deeply isolated external observer, forever sealing all the profound, powerful agony of their shattered psychological reality in the dense containment field of the material wall. My final, logical terror was complete. The active, aggressive reflection of intense emotional tension was not the single psychological projection of the single victim. It was the vast, permanent, total active demonic vigilance of the entire deep black wall's vast, intelligent mind itself, waiting patiently for its final, absolute emotional failure to be absorbed permanently into the absolute, complete blackness of the immense, cold paint. Story 6. I was the senior maintenance chief, overseeing the immense process of safely demolishing a massive, sprawling, century-old hydroelectric power dam on the Columbia River. The structure, all cold, dark, immense, old-growth concrete, was a complete technological relic, permanently dead, sealed off, and scheduled for precise sectional demolition. My base was simply a small, abandoned, glass-sealed, single-man control booth perched precariously 400 feet above the entire valley. My work kept me isolated and consumed by endless paperwork. The background sound was deafening, monotonous, and immense, the heavy, sheer roar of the dam's overflow system mixed with the chaotic, relentless sound of the deep, cold, atmospheric rain, which endlessly lashed the glass enclosure. My terror began entirely in spite of the overwhelming physical chaos and sound. I was signing off on the final structural closure of the main turbine hall, the massive, cold, deep section of the facility below the river line where all the sheer immense industrial power of the structure had once been focused, a full 5 stories down. My handheld structural analyzer, which registered all core frequency outputs, remained oddly silent. But my own perception, even through the dense, high acoustic volume of the endless chaos, picked up a single, rhythmic, incredibly high-pitched internal noise, ping, ping, ping. It was the sound of a heavy, precise metal hammer hitting a single, empty, high-tensile steel structural support beam deep below the ground line. The sound was faint, pure, rhythmic, totally mechanical, and completely drowned out by the external rain. I pressed my ear hard against the cold metal of the tower base. The rhythmic metallic ping only intensified, forcing itself through the sheer tonnage of structural steel, completely unmuffled by the immense surrounding noise. I immediately grabbed my old, industrial issue, 2-foot-long adjustable monkey wrench, my simple, trusted tool, and raced down the hundreds of flights of the cold, wet, rattling metal internal stairs to find the source. Logic stated a single piece of cold, stressed steel must have failed its bond. It took me 10 full, terrifying minutes to find the exact source deep inside the vast, cold, concrete machine pit. The rhythmic ping was entirely localized, coming from the perfect, flat, metal wall of a completely decommissioned reservoir cooling tank, a massive, 30-foot-high, empty steel unit, sealed high above the main flood control floor. The immense tank, completely sealed up, should have been sterile and entirely silent. But sitting precisely on the small access port hatch on the bottom of the external seam, right where the sound emanated, was a large, wet, immensely black, leather-bound, old-style schoolbook bag. The external surface of the immense object was entirely covered in a thick, dense, waterlogged black silt and coal dust, the exact, specific chemical component of the submerged ground sediment the structure rested on. I backed up slowly, training my high-intensity light on the silent bag. The rhythmic ping ceased completely, immediately replaced by a quick, organized, soft series of 3 simple, intelligent knock-knock-knock sounds coming from directly inside the metal tank itself. The immense silence that followed the 3 distinct taps was immediately replaced by a terrifying, high-pitched, exhausted, low, entirely dry whisper emanating directly from the empty external air of the space between the massive structural tank and my freezing body. "Where is his map? He should have found the line for the exit now. Only the map works now. You must find it and follow his plan." The urgent, high-pitched male voice, driven by enormous emotional intensity, only faded when I physically lunged backward. I understood the simple terror immediately. The persistent, rhythmic, precise acoustic attack on the silent tank was not a simple poltergeist. The overwhelming organized signal was a single, sustained, terrifying mental signal from the soul of a single, deeply lost, dead apprentice engineer who was permanently trapped inside the sealed structure after the final flood control closure 10 years prior. His overwhelming psychic trauma had entirely consumed all internal physical resistance, forcing his mind to repeat only the simple mechanical acoustic pattern that would draw the single living subject to his exact final resting place. I fled the machine pit completely and instantly, abandoning all tools and equipment, scrambling and running hard up the terrifyingly long ladder to the safe structure of the control room. I did not stop until I was standing inside the familiar, immense sound of the entire final storm. The complex was entirely silent. The immense sound returned to its normal, relentless roar. I quit the contract immediately. I never went back. The final, terrible, chilling truth of the lost engineer's map was revealed after a simple phone inquiry to the decommissioning project archives. The vast, immense complexity of the power structure was a perfect replica of the immense structural reality that had completely consumed all final exits. His final desperate attempt to escape was leaving both the single physical school bag, the single object closest to his last living actions, and a single, immense, subtle acoustic vibration as a message for an external living soul to finally find and use the single element he had relied on most for survival. His agonizing, rhythmic, trapped final message remains a persistent sound distortion in every single low-frequency sound system I ever turn on. Story 7. I was assigned to run a final demolition survey on an ancient, multi-level wooden freight dock near Houghton, on the shore of Lake Superior, the massive, cold, immense freshwater sea of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. The gigantic, sprawling industrial pier, entirely constructed of decaying, massive timber, was due for a complete teardown, and my sole job was to perform a 3-day safety inspection. I was completely alone, utterly isolated in a cold, small aluminum construction shack on the final edge of the decaying timber platform. The background noise was a profound acoustic experience, the sheer, immense power of the cold freshwater waves thrashing and sucking rhythmically against the hollow pilings below me, completely joined by the constant, aggressive rain hammering the metal roof. My initial terror was subtle, entirely visual, and profoundly unsettling. I was running a basic acoustic structural audit on the immense, dark, black oil pilings below me, using a sensitive, remote camera probe with an intensely focused light source, entirely contained within its small cylindrical casing. The low-frequency sonar mapping was consistent with slow structural decay. But the camera feed, beamed live to my small console, displayed an extreme, repetitive anomaly in the dark, cold water below. In the profound pitch black of the water, just below the surface, where the extreme opacity and the chaotic churn of the rain should have created a blinding, continuous glare of static, I saw a profound absence of light. A single, localized, utterly massive, high-density black blot of water-filled darkness occupied all three viewing angles immediately above the largest structural timber anchoring the long pier, the base point of all the decay. The profound darkness defied a simple technical explanation. My analytical attention snapped completely to the single anomaly. The colossal dark object now began to move, a slow, terrifying, massive vertical ascension from the deepest, blackest part of the massive lake, rising slowly, consistently, and without a single physical break of the surface water tension. The immense object was completely silent. Its deep, organized volume produced no single sound beyond the deep, muffled pulse of its displacement. I am watching a submarine surface at the wrong coordinates. My mind screamed against the logical flaw of the total silence. I immediately abandoned all logical thought. I was watching something colossal, organized, malevolent, entirely wet, and rapidly approaching my fragile location from the immense, cold, deep void. I realized that the single, huge black thing had made a terrifyingly rapid physical connection to my fragile timber structure. The structural integrity audit was entirely irrelevant. The massive black thing had completely focused on me. I grabbed the only remaining piece of equipment, a small, high-intensity, physical video camera with a manually powered external flash, and aimed it straight down into the cold, chaotic, black swirling surface of the immense water's surface, triggering a full-spectrum, organized flash event. My intention was simple: to get a single, clear, tangible visual confirmation of the immense object that was actively pulling life from the deep. The immensely strong, cold flash illuminated the immediate periphery of the deep water below for only a single millisecond. The image, permanently set right into the external digital card, which I immediately checked, confirmed the massive terror. Disassembling the dock was simply a final, terrifying warning. The single still frame of the utter chaos confirmed the single physical truth of the massive intrusion, a colossal, fully articulated, ancient, impossibly immense human head, male, ancient, covered in massive, thick, dark brown seaweed and dense, waterlogged timber sediment, filled the entire single frame of the vast, isolated water's surface. The features were immense and distinct. The huge, unblinking eyes were terrifyingly fixed on the optical visual point of my descending camera. The waterlogged titan was not observing me or the vast timber complex. It was explicitly locked on the single light source that disturbed its complete, utter isolation. The colossal head immediately sank back into the cold blackness with a massive, sucking, horrific acoustic slosh of displacement that created a concentric ring of pure, terrified water chaos around the immense area. The immense sound was joined immediately by a terrifying, prolonged, raw, guttural, low man's crying, a long, controlled sound of immense, sustained emotional failure, now entirely amplified by the acoustic resonance of the hollow timber pilings below my feet. The entire immense water body was sobbing at me. I screamed and ran from the absolute black perimeter of the small structure, abandoning all tools and contracts instantly. The maintenance director's report after my flight concluded the terrifying, final reality of my single encounter. The colossal, single, main timber piling that anchored 1/10 of the vast dock structure had mysteriously and simultaneously vanished from its sublevel cement footing, cleanly broken off at the base plate in the vast, still body of water. The frightening volume of the entire structural decay was completely unexplained. The terrifying final single image I now carry of the massive, crying head on the enormous chaotic water surface is my eternal nightmare. The disassembling of the old timber was the terrifying, complex, organized physical escape ritual of a massive, confined god of the cold freshwater SEA, and the camera had only captured the precise, terrifying visual moment when its full, eternal, massive, organizational sentience had achieved sufficient volume to complete the profound act of the structural self-release. Story 8. Up Interstate 79 in Boone County, West Virginia, they don't tear down the old coal mines. They simply seal them. My job was as a geological site surveyor for a regulatory agency, essentially, certifying the integrity of those seals after a disaster. The one that almost took my sanity with it was the notorious Black Creek shaft, a massive, ancient vertical drop that had been permanently sealed with 200 feet of thick cement and 20 tons of slate slag after a tragic methane explosion in 1971. I was there late one November, spending 2 full nights in a tiny, heatless trailer directly over the exposed shaft opening, listening only to the constant, cold, miserable hammering of the heavy winter rain on my metal roof. My entire existence was dedicated to guaranteeing the profound, black silence below the surface. The initial anomaly was subtle. The site was abandoned, not a living soul for 10 miles, and my highly sensitive geological sound monitors, devices designed to pick up faint micro-tremors deep within the bedrock, registered a peculiar acoustic signature. Not geological movement after the explosion, but a localized energy wave that was too symmetrical, too loud, and entirely human-made. It was a continuous, frantic, complex sound that radiated from exactly 180 feet below the surface, just beneath the concrete seal. The sound wasn't knocking nor scratching. It was singing. A vast, chaotic, rhythmic chorus of 50 or 60 male voices singing the exact same single, high-pitched mournful hymn over and over in a sustained, low-level drone of intense, psychic despair. My mind immediately jumped to every plausible, non-supernatural explanation: gas venting through the old pipe system, electrical anomalies amplifying an external sound, even simple auditory delusion due to the intense isolation. But the equipment read a profound geological disturbance right at the seal, corresponding perfectly to the sound. Against my safety orders, I attached a powerful, single-source directional microphone directly to the top anchor of the old, defunct steel winch cable that dropped straight into the shaft. I needed absolute audibility to prove the phenomenon was not real. What came out of the speaker feed was total, devastating coherence. The singing below was the sound of eternal prayer, a precise, organized, agonizing plea of intense devotion. Interspersed in the immense religious drone, I heard distinct, short, high-pitched bursts of language followed by long lines of frantic, continuous, sustained sobbing and pleading. The accent was unrecognizable, the language not English, not Italian, not Spanish. It was a rough, guttural, archaic set of long vowel sounds that vibrated with intense, palpable, ancient despair as they echoed inside the massive, cold, cylindrical shaft. The terrifying truth of the abandoned coal mine shaft was simple. The blast had not stopped the miners' work. It had simply sealed a massive volume of active, terrified, continuous, conscious human despair, and my sound equipment had just given their eternal, dying panic a direct voice from the cold bedrock. The sound intensified rapidly, the chorus becoming absolutely synchronized. Now, a final, authoritative, powerful bass drum beat began to control the immense, disorganized chorus of prayer below, beating a slow, steady, powerful rhythm that sounded like a deep, agonizing heart beating slow blood into the cold stone. With the introduction of the rhythmic drum pulse, the ancient, frightening sound of the chorus shifted completely. The prayer hymn vanished, replaced by a single, focused, intense, repeated collective chant, a guttural, long, organized vowel sound that rapidly climaxed in a low, focused, organized scream, the immense, collective scream of 50 dead souls giving immense, final energy to a single purpose. The unified blast immediately cut into one terrifying piece of single-word speech delivered by that organizing voice with the commanding, authoritative presence of a pure, physical, demonic presence. The voice filled the small cab, thick, dry, completely alien, sounding as if it was pushing sound directly through wet soil and compressed rock, utterly unafraid of my presence. The veil is thin. The word ended with a prolonged, violent surge of internal pressure, a loud, physical crack from directly below the cement seal that violently bucked and heaved the small metal trailer high into the cold night air. The anchor point for my attached microphone completely failed. The massive winch steel cable assembly was torn from its socket with the incredible physical trauma. My equipment died completely. The monitors turned black, the sound feed instantly cut off, and the entire trailer plunged into an agonizing, echoing blackness, leaving only the deafening sound of a steady, relentless rain outside hitting the roof and the intense, persistent feeling of total fear. I had been sitting exactly 180 feet over their permanent, final, inescapable prison. I didn't wait any longer. I'd bailed out of the trailer immediately, running headfirst for the nearest power line, 6 miles away, and calling the emergency response crew to confess all the horrific noise I had discovered. I quit my surveyor job the next day and had a total psychological meltdown fueled by the intense terror of the single, organized sound from below. My final, most accurate report was delivered to the project foreman by the maintenance crew's subsequent inspection. The massive hydraulic cement top over the disaster had a fresh, 3-foot-long, deep, terrifying horizontal crack that had not been present the day prior. I know now the eternal, horrible truth of my fear. The explosion had only separated the miners from the surface world, trapping their entire collective human focus in the silent stone below. And by attaching my microphone to the seal, I had given their collective, final, terrible life purpose a single, organized voice and a massive, single focal point of human energy. The deep hole was not a mine, it was a perpetual, profound devil's prison, and the demon inside had just successfully orchestrated a large-scale structural failure in an effort to finally break the seal and return to the light of the living. Story 9. I was taking an overnight, isolated audit contract on a sprawling, massive, unlit, completely abandoned former hydroelectric power dam on the Columbia River, a dark, cold concrete relic of immense industrial might. The structure was permanently dead, sealed off, and scheduled for absolute, precise sectional demolition. My base was simply a small, abandoned, single-man control booth perched precariously high above the valley in a small metal tower. My entire existence was consumed by endless paperwork and watching the permanent, immense, organized structural decay. The background noise was deafening, monotonous, and immense. The heavy, sheer roar of the dam's overflow system mixed with the chaotic, relentless sound of the deep, cold, atmospheric rain, which endlessly lashed the glass enclosure around my single isolated space. My fear began entirely in spite of the vast external chaos. As I was signing off on the final structural closing of the main turbine hall, the massive, cold, deep section of the immense facility below the river line, I looked down into the sheer, black, vertical void where the main support scaffolding was positioned. My handheld structural analyzer registered a complete energy vacuum. But my own concentration, even through the chaotic, high acoustic volume of the outside elements, immediately picked up the immense, singular, rhythmic, high-pitched internal noise that transcended the natural sound field. Ring, ring, ring. It was the perfectly clear, precise sound of an immense, old-style bell phone ringing internally inside the sheer, static heart of the silent turbine wall. The acoustic source was massive, perfect, rhythmic, and incredibly loud. I abandoned my physical safety gear immediately, plunging down the endless cold, wet, rattling metal internal stairs to find the sound source. The immense silence around the loud, rhythmic ringing was broken entirely by my massive effort. It took me 10 full, chaotic minutes to find the entire localized phenomenon deep inside the vast, dead concrete machine pit. The sound was entirely coming from the single structural component of a permanently sealed, decommissioned, high-altitude maintenance box, an ugly gray steel cupboard that was bolted and sealed into the sheer wall, easily 5 stories down. The single phone inside was ringing with chaotic, terrifying violence. I unscrewed the massive, cold latch on the door with immense, frantic speed. The heavy steel door flew open with a hydraulic suck, and the internal sound immediately vanished. The phone, a large, black, industrial-grade rotary phone, hanging slack under the sheer force of its endless, chaotic activity, was utterly, terrifyingly dead. No sound, no light, no energy, except for the incredible, unnatural heat that simply radiated from the single cold, black, heavy receiver. I picked up the intense, hot receiver with my gloved hand. The line in my ear was completely dead. Absolute, cold silence. The only sound was the immense, ambient noise of the external storm outside. Just as I was about to drop the immense, frightening receiver, the cold, static line in my hand immediately transmitted a single, agonizing, organized, clear, full-bodied whisper directly into my ear. It was entirely my own name, Mark, spoken with an immense, terrifying, complete knowledge of immediate presence and intense focus. Marak, we are here now. The water is waiting for the sign. You just opened the door for us. The voice ended completely. I dropped the receiver as if it were white-hot lava and ran hard, not back up the frightening line, but straight out the tunnel access door, screaming my full, absolute, terrifying confession out into the absolute silence of the immense valley. I quit the job immediately. I do not answer phones in the dark anymore. The terrifying phenomenon from the isolation was simple. The silence of the sealed dam structure had become the terrifying, active, immense acoustic chamber for the final souls of the construction crew who had been accidentally drowned in the vast internal water pits decades prior. They did not need a phone to call out. They only needed the single, active, electrical line of the motel phone call in the sealed structure to simply permanently activate the organized psychic sound distortion that entirely consumed and trapped the final human witness. I realized that my own terrified voice was simply the signal for the waiting entities to complete their organized final human capture. I do not answer rings now. Story 10. The intense cold and the dense fog of the old house was what I both hated and needed. It was a massive, beautiful, crumbling Victorian house that bordered a large, silent lake in remote upstate New York, a gift from my eccentric, recently deceased aunt. I was completely isolated, attempting to convert the inherited structure into a silent, organized writing retreat, battling only the intense, natural loneliness of the complete, permanent, quiet silence. The perpetual sound of the massive, cold, aggressive, non-stop rainstorm outside washing the immense cedar shakes on the roof entirely consumed the entire world, amplifying the profound isolation I was entirely trapped in. My fear was completely localized to my single point of weakness. Because the power was erratic and the central furnace was broken, I was entirely dependent on a single, clean-burning kerosene lamp, a small, 2-foot-tall glass lantern perched precariously on a wooden desk directly in the center of the vast, silent, 2-floor library. I was writing an intense, non-fiction technical manual, and I spent 20 hours a day in its faint light, obsessed over the technical precision of its single output. The sound started a single week into my residence. The single desk lamp was burning brightly, throwing a circle of intense orange color against the deep, consuming psychological darkness of the silent, immense library. A profound, constant, rhythmic, low-frequency sloshing noise began, emanating entirely from inside the final, silent room on an antique, polished wooden stand 5 feet from my ear. A small, beautiful, single, completely transparent glass pitcher filled to the brim with clear water. The intense, low-frequency sound was relentless. The clear, persistent sound of cold, silent water being forced and sloshed rhythmically and intensely against the interior glass surface. The rhythmic, continuous slosh was a complete auditory defiance of physics. The immense, cold, polished, single piece of ornamental pitcher glassware, sitting absolutely still in the dark, contained a miniature, isolated, immense internal wave of water that was being forced continuously around its own perimeter, constantly sloshing into and over a powerful internal physical resistance. I grabbed the heavy, thick brass frame of the lantern and threw its intense light directly onto the terrifying relic. The subtle, mesmerizing motion of the terrified internal wave inside the glass pitcher froze instantly. The water inside the glass became completely, perfectly, powerfully, terrifically more still. No surface tension, no sign of any physical, outside motion, a massive volume of immense, heavy, motionless water that defied the local law of continuous interior vibration. My logic screamed the single, obvious truth. This object was reacting to my sudden, unexpected, intense human presence entirely, and its terrifying, physical acoustic motion was its isolated warning signal. The moment my arm began to slowly move toward the glass to simply physically disrupt the stillness, the intense, silent water inside the glass pitching snapped entirely out of its silence, exploding with such immense force that a physical wave of immense freezing water crashed hard and fast against its own glass circumference, completely defying the entire physical cohesion of its solid frame container. The massive, acoustic trauma subsided, immediately replaced by a terrified, aggressive, organizing female whisper, entirely dry and clear, emanating directly from the exact center of the immense, cold water in the glass. "Don't touch the surface again. The silence is necessary for the final sleep now. The mirror is clean." The terrifying voice confirmed my terror. The spirit who had just possessed the glass was fighting a complete, singular, eternal war to actively maintain the entire single structural surface tension of the water's quiet, reflective, immense surface power. The terror was pure and psychological. I had only to touch the surface to break its full, psychological concentration. I retreated entirely, grabbing a thick, raw cotton towel, covering the entire immense body of the beautiful, powerful, dangerous artifact. The profound physical cold it radiated was immediately absorbed by the mass of my defense, intensifying the immense heat of its presence in the absolute silent atmosphere. I knew the single object was too dangerous to fight. I quit the writing job immediately. The house was not merely haunted. The beautiful, dangerous piece of antique glass was a complete, powerful external psychic storage container, engineered entirely to preserve and contain the profound, immense, permanent, suicidal terror of its original owner, my aunt, at the exact single point of her emotional collapse. The persistent, internal wave motion was the terrified physical manifestation of her own mind's continuous, total, internal chaos fighting for release. The profound simple rule of logic was now absolute. My aunt had not wanted her tortured internal soul to physically escape. The immense, aggressive cold of the relentless external rain outside simply offered the single, intense, external vibrational and physical energy source needed to fuel her terrifying psychological distress, amplifying the intensity of her single, emotional water wave. My final single horror, the complete, total, quiet silence of the immense library was not a sanctuary. It was the vast, silent, simple-minded, immensely powerful acoustic microphone for a single, small, transparent glass vessel, permanently waiting for a terrifying voice to emerge from its surface tension-bound world. Story 11. I was the maintenance technician for an enormous public transportation authority's control center in downtown Boston, an entire floor of a cold, massive, early 1900s stone structure dedicated entirely to tracking subway train locations. My working hours were isolated and late, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., during which the total silent room was only broken by the soft, electric hum of the vast, intricate control map panels that spanned the entire circumference of the cold space. My only other ambient sound was the persistent, deep, constant, intense, cold rain that inevitably washed the dense, fog-ridden, external stone structure for 8 months a year. The phenomenon began subtly. I was running a final manual system sync on the deepest segment of the old underground tunnel lines, the Red Line South Tunnel, which ran directly under the city's old docks, when my screen received a terrifying, immense visual signal. The single train tracking sensor, stationed South Bay, went immediately dark, accompanied by an absolute, profound silence that pervaded the highly sensitive audio monitoring system. My entire system's logic screamed a single, terrifying truth. A full train was stuck and completely inert deep within the waterlogged segment of the underground tunnel. My immediate supervisor dismissed the entire incident, citing deep structural water bleed off that had completely corrupted the system's simple external telemetry. I logged it on his official instruction. But the profound psychological terror was immediately localized. I could not sleep for 3 straight nights. On the 4th night, in the deep core of the absolute quiet, I returned to the cold, dead silent control center. The full line status for the South Bay segment was completely restored. No maintenance work had been done, and the main digital map showed a complete, fully operating blue line moving consistently through the silent, dark tunnel. Everything was safe. I collapsed into my seat, exhausted. But as I stared at the restored segment of the tracking display, a full, cohesive, entirely separate single, ghost tracking light abruptly activated on the top plate of the main board. It was a single, intensely clear red light pulsing slowly over the physical location of the South Bay Tunnel segment. The red pulsing light did not belong to the digital map system. It was a physical, hand-painted, archaic analog indicator built into the original 1920s metal structure of the control board, completely decommissioned decades ago, only used to designate profound, non-digital, permanent structural faults that could only be visually observed. The immense terror of the red light's unprompted return, the drowned hallway's single, ultimate symbol of absolute failure, was immediately absolute. I grabbed the heavy, industrial-grade audio headset, the powerful, analog communication device that directly connected the control center wall to the submerged tracks below, and violently pressed the heavy, cold apparatus tight against my ear. The total silence that filled the line was broken immediately by a high-pitched, faint, but organized and rhythmic squeaking. The rhythmic sound was complex, immense, and entirely physical, the wet, intense, organized squeak of massive frog or toad feet making short, terrifyingly precise, organized movements completely against the deep metal of the old line, accompanied by the slow physical slosh of immense volumes of cold, deep water being forced out of a structural container. I realized with a searing wave of visual terror exactly what the terror was. The drowned tunnels had structurally failed. The profound sound of the massive, cold, deep-bodied creatures squeaking on the tracks immediately faded out, completely replaced by a low, consistent, profoundly sad, immense human whisper that spoke directly into the cold, compressed volume of the old analog wire. The voice was pure, desperate, completely exhausted, and completely male, driven by profound physical desperation. "It's not safe here, Mark. The water and the cold have already taken the line. You have to leave the station now. They are riding a solid wave line up the single structural slope now. Your console will be their final stop." The terrifying voice knew my correct first name. I was entirely compromised and the single recipient of the final message. I hurled the headset completely out from my seat, screaming, tearing the immense headphones from my body. I fled the cold control room entirely, running hard out of the back exit door, abandoning the entire structural complex to its inevitable, complete, structural and human collapse, never to return. The devastating final truth of my terrible, long night confirmed all historical precedent. The drowned hallway entity was not a human ghost trying to ask for rescue. It was the final, terrifying, organized soul of the drowned, dead train that had gone down decades ago, now actively riding a terrifying physical wave of pure external water and life-filled creatures, the immense, organized family of frogs and toads, up the massive single structural slope of the entire tunnel line. My terrified, single living presence was simply the final, required target needed to complete its agonizing, eternal journey of final, full, complete, overwhelming, wet return to the dry, complete, final light of the open surface world. Story 12. Up Interstate 70 in the cold, desolate, completely empty farmland section of Nebraska, you don't take risks. I was driving a fully loaded, high-value, semi-trailer east to Omaha, trapped entirely within a massive, slow, aggressive, 3-day rainstorm that had completely consumed the flat, endless plains. The rain was constant, the wind brutal, and the low, diffuse, uniform yellow highway lights provided only enough light to confirm the absolute total structural silence around every side of the long straight highway. I pulled off the main line completely, desperate for quick rest inside the heavy sound of the deluge, seeking the isolated safety of the immense, cold, entirely dead silent central Nebraska truck stop's massive asphalt lot. I locked my cab. I pulled the immense security blankets fully across the windshield for dark isolation. I had been asleep for less than 30 minutes when an immense, shocking, profound blast of cold, clean, aggressive air completely snapped me instantly back to full, terrified awareness. The air in the cab, utterly sealed 3 minutes before, was intensely cold, sharp, and smelling of immense, raw, hot, dry iron dust, the exact, profound, dry metallic odor that only accompanies a high-intensity grinding of industrial steel against steel. My mind screamed internal confusion. There was no steel mill complex for a full 1,000 miles in either direction. Where was the grinding dust coming from in the intense, external, water-filled silence? I immediately pulled the immense security blanket completely off the front window. The immense, empty, terrifyingly quiet asphalt lot was still a massive sheet of blackness. But the sound completely snapped back from the exterior world. Directly in front of my fully illuminated truck cab, standing completely alone in the dense, rhythmic hammer storm, a solitary human figure stood, a massive, huge-shouldered man, entirely draped in a heavy, cold, old-style, black, professional smelter's apron, the ancient uniform that covered all modern environmental armor. The solitary, terrifying figure was immobile, immensely still, fully facing my final exit path, with his entire black hood completely hiding the visual line of his features. The terrifyingly precise metallic dust cold radiated powerfully from his thick, protective gear, entirely dominating the localized 3 feet of space around my final refuge. I was paralyzed by immediate, physical terror. This was not a simple human. This entire structural event defied all physical law. The massive figure did not look at me. Instead, it slowly, precisely, deliberately walked through a perfect, enormous semicircle of ritual motion fully around the exposed front half of my massive truck's cab, each slow, immense, grinding footstep creating a strange, single acoustic anomaly on the pristine wet asphalt, a profound, non-audio, physical gathering sound coming from the metal that no modern human foot can make. The terrifying ritual finished, and the massive figure stopped, resting all his immense weight against the right side fuel tank of my single, parked truck. He spoke only once, but the sound was raw, dry, immense, and incredibly cold, a thick, slurred, high-pitched squeal emanating directly from the interior of his closed steel welder's hood, accompanied by a quick, terrified, audible stream of immense, fast human prayer delivered entirely outside the final acoustic volume. The chaotic sound was completely dominating the silence. The terrifyingly rough, dry, slurred, agonizing male whisper spoke one single, terrifying, absolute sentence. "The final product must be clean, Michael. The master wants the floor immaculate. You left the metal dust behind. You must return to the cleaning floor immediately." The immensely cold voice knew my final name. I was completely consumed by the final, single, complete terror of the profound personal compromise. I fled the entire complex, screaming over the top of my massive dashboard, scrambling out of the opposite passenger door, and running hard into the whiteout chaos of the aggressive rainstorm. I abandoned the truck, the keys, the money, and all of the high-value cargo entirely on the immense, terrifyingly cold lot. The final, terrifying logical truth of the factory floor cleaner was entirely simple, cold, and final. The cold, massive, single, aggressive, high-pitched figure in the black smelter's gear was not an internal ghost I could defeat. It was a permanent, terrifying, powerful external demonic reaper of industrial perfection, permanently anchored to a terrifying, single structural ritual. The immense, violent psychic trauma it generated through the constant, overwhelming physical pressure I experienced entirely within the sealed truck cab was simply his physical reminder of my past, uncompleted industrial task. Its absolute, core objective was to physically and absolutely force me to return to the condemned building to complete the one final, crucial, professional task I had abandoned. A permanent, thorough, high-intensity cleaning of all industrial metal dust I had left behind. In the immense structural chaos. Story 13. Up Interstate 40 in the isolated, high, cold plateaus of the central Arizona desert, the absolute darkness is broken only by the immense, cold, constant, rhythmic downpour of massive, isolated rainstorms, the kind of environment that strips away your mind's internal defenses. I was running a long-haul contract driving specialized research equipment, my base of operations entirely confined to the small, insulated metal shell of my truck's cab as I crossed the empty Navajo Nation. My shift was all midnight driving, staring through the high-intensity beams into the heavy, constant, drumming rain that made the entire dry environment seem perpetually cold and wet. In an area of non-existent human signals, my single, old, worn FM radio provided the only comfort against that total isolation. The terror began abruptly, a single acoustic anomaly on the low end of the FM spectrum, near 90.1. I flipped my dial down one notch from the crackling Spanish church music, and the expected static noise was quickly replaced by a sudden, sustained, low-pitched drone. The sound was entirely synthesized, like a perfect, continuous, single-frequency test tone. It was incredibly loud, incredibly clear, and completely without any recognizable human origin. My hand seized on the warm dial, convinced I had somehow just tuned into a powerful, isolated military broadcast signal. The low-frequency drone was immediately superimposed with a clear, calm, incredibly dry human voice, a distinct, steady, low-volume bass monologue that was speaking a full, complex paragraph of continuous information directly into my single right ear, as if the source audio was physically generated inside the very center of my speaker panel under the sheer sound pressure of the electronic drone. The terrifying content of the voice wasn't a military code or instruction. It was my voice. Precisely mine. My natural baritone, my specific, fast cadence, even the subtle, nervous upward tick at my vocal inflection. But the content was wrong. The voice was not narrating today's thoughts. It was having a furious, internalized argument with itself over the contents of my own private journal entries. The argument was frantic, delivered in a rush of strained energy, speaking of anxieties I hadn't voiced out loud in years. No, don't mention the code. Stop talking about the dog. The dog is irrelevant. You are isolating yourself too easily, Mark. You are doing this to yourself. The terror gripped me immediately. I was listening to a clear, precise, current reflection of my total, complete internal monologue, broadcast out over a powerful radio frequency. The sheer audacity of the privacy violation was crippling. I snatched my hand from the dial as if the single piece of industrial equipment was scalding my skin. Logically, I knew it must be some incredible atmospheric trick. Temperature inversion, high-altitude static mixed with a distant broadcast. But the sound wasn't distorted, and the sentences were completely coherent, intelligent, and focused on my mind's content. My body felt immediately attacked. I sat in absolute stillness in the vibrating metal and glass cage of the van, heart hammering intensely, staring out at the blurred blackness of the thick, fast-moving rain. I pulled the small emergency receiver closer to my right ear, listening to the private mental terror. The voice, my voice, continued his monologue, moving on from private fears to a short review of my immediate circumstances. He sees the mountain. Don't look at the mountain. The code is 1782. You are going to look for the fire now. Don't go. My internal voice was now narrating a desperate, clear warning about my intentions 10 minutes into my future. I threw the metal radio handset to the floor, terrified of its utter accuracy. I drove the heavy van hard out of the pull-off, determined to escape the acoustic anomaly and find a single motel with a working television. Not 2 minutes later, driving the dark highway hard into the wall of chaotic rain, the driver's side front tire abruptly collapsed with an enormous, physical bang. I wrestled the heavy van hard to the shoulder, almost fishtailing into the black, unlit abyss of the valley 40 feet below. The van was immobilized, dead. I scrambled out into the immense, chaotic storm, shining my powerful lamp at the shattered tire. The steel wheel housing was catastrophically failed, not a simple blowout, but a linear, clean snap across the steel core itself. I called an emergency tow back to Albuquerque, leaving the broken machine and its final terrifying warning. I huddled inside the driver's cab, shaking violently, desperately avoiding contact with any of the internal wiring connected to the stereo. The tow truck arrived an hour later, a heavy, familiar 1940s model. The driver, a weathered man in a deep, dark oilskin coat, spoke to me only once, his voice cracking like dry tree branches. Bad brake. Real bad metal fatigue. You shouldn't have been listening to that nonsense, son. I looked at him, startled. He knew about the radio. He just quietly shook his head, shining his massive, red floodlight on the broken van's wreckage. He unhooked the powerful tow hook and started the immense, slow, physical labor of connecting the broken rear axle. The rhythmic clanging of the 3-foot-long, heavy-duty tow chain connecting the two massive vehicles was the only stable sound in the world, a comforting, simple, mechanical labor sound. Then, one long, terrifying, high-pitched scream cut through the sound of the rain, the horrifying noise of the massive tow chain as it violently retracted its safety mechanism for the final, violent pull. The sound ended. The towman just stood there completely silent in the intense, high-energy red glare of his own machinery, his dark, soaking oilskin coat covering his entire face. He took a single deep, loud sharp intake of frozen breath, the sound of someone just emerging from the cold lake. Then, the rhythmic sound of a familiar voice began to speak in a strange, thick, waxy bass tone right against the cab's small vent. "Don't look at the back of the tire, Mark. It's too late. The light is terrible, and the tow is needed for the broken seal you are making. You should have stayed isolated." The voice was mine again, but severely distorted by the massive external cold being pressed to the wall. I abandoned the van and the tow operator right there, running headfirst into the immense, isolated darkness of the cold desert night. The voice under the desert radio wasn't a warning about my journey. It was a sophisticated, pervasive network parasite feeding on my anxiety that knew the exact structural flaw of my vehicle, providing a terror that only spoke in cold, hard, precise, external facts. I never touched a radio again. The voice was the sound of my own ultimate, inevitable, systemic collapse.